winter of 1887 swept across Montana without warning. It brought a death sentence. For Wade Hart, 58, that sentence hung over the dying cattle in the valley, their dry pasture depleted. For Nora Bell, it lay in the hearth that was suffocating the lives of 20 children. If the hearth died, the school would close. And if the school closed, the young teacher who had just fled a forced marriage would lose the only place where she could live freely with her honor. Nora had been warned not to seek out Wade Hart. Since his wife's death 11 years ago, the widower had locked himself away, both at home and in his heart. He refused work and no longer wanted to save anyone.
"I heard you can make the fireplace stop trying to kill my students," Nora said without pleading.
She looked him straight in the eye. For the first time in a decade, Wade Hart entered a place where there were people. When Nora offered him her meager silver coins, his calloused, blood-stained hand brushed them away. This part, consider it me buying firewood for the children. Nora thought she had just found a benefactor, someone strong enough to withstand even the cold of the frontier, until she saw the dropped notice. A credit card for animal feed had been refused in extension. The man who had just spent his own money warming her classroom was, in fact, just one storm away from losing his entire livelihood and home. The debt notice lying on the classroom floor didn't bother Wade as much as the biting cold penetrating the livestock. These 300 acres of inherited land were all he had left. If Pike Bank cut off his winter feed credit, the cattle would perish in the blizzard, and the Hart name would be erased from the valley. But for the past 11 years, Wade hadn't lived to conquer adversity. He lived as a man serving a sentence, mending fences, measuring hay, and keeping the silence in the house unbroken. Nora Bell wasn't the type of woman to cast a pitying glance at a man's debt notice and then sit silently sighing. She had her own battle for survival. When students were absent due to lack of firewood and illness, she didn't wait for the school board to judge or resolve the issue. She stepped into the eye of the storm herself. Their second meeting didn't take place by romantic candlelight, but in sub-zero temperatures beside a frozen stream. Nora stopped only to ask for directions to avoid the thin ice. But when she saw the old man struggling against the dilapidated state of the farm, she spoke without any polite formality. "Your fence is very well maintained." Wade didn't look up, his scarred hands still gripping the rusty wire. "A good fence never asks its keeper if they're tired, Miss Bell." Only 15 seconds of brief conversation, but that was enough for Nora to understand that this widow was using hard work to punish herself, and enough for Wade to realize that this woman wasn't afraid of his toughness. But in the Wild West, no secrets remain buried under the snow forever. The 12-mile distance from town to the ranch seemed far, but not far enough to escape the watchful eyes of those who held the power to decide the fate of both of them. In Gray Creek, blizzards could clog up any road, but rumors always travel faster than the finest horses. A young school teacher riding 12 miles to a widower's house was quickly conjured up into a moral scandal. And when Ben Pike's pride, the powerful young man whose dinner invitation Nora had just refused, was wounded, the Pike family began to tighten the noose. Silas Pike never publicly lost his temper. He wielded his power in the most pragmatic way, suspending Wade's winter hay credit The reason given was a single chilling statement. The bank doesn't give money to those whose minds wander with gossip. Wade's livelihood was threatened, and Nora's honor was at stake. However, those who threw the anonymous warning note into the classroom had misjudged her. Nora hadn't canceled a wedding in Billings to flee here and let another town define what decency meant for her. The next morning, she saddled herself against the storm. Because if a child was absent because their home was too cold, she wouldn't wait for her reputation to warm up before setting off. Love in the Wild West isn't built on sweet words or dramatic displays. It blossomed through an old handbook that Wade had actually memorized 10 years earlier, but which he accepted simply because, for the first time, someone remembered him beyond being a debtor. And it was confirmed by 2 cups of coffee laid out on the table. Wade offered no explanation. But those 2 cups of coffee were a silent confession. He had waited for her. He had dropped his guard to allow another person into this lonely world. They didn't talk about the future or their feelings. They talked about the ice on the gutters, the direction of the wind, and the meager amount of firewood left at the school. Nora knew the school would have to close without firewood. And the next day, before the sun even rose, Wade left a cartload of dry wood behind the classroom. He did it in the shadows so no one would see, and Nora accepted it in silence so as not to embarrass him. They understood each other through selfless sacrifice. But every fire kindled in the middle of winter comes with a price. While Wade Hart used his silence to warm Nora's classroom, in another room, those in power in the town were preparing to set fire to the entire life she had just painstakingly built. When those who have been hurt are faced with something good, their first instinct is not to accept it, but to destroy it before it can hurt them. Wade Hart did just that. In the December chill, he used reason to push Nora away. He reminded her that he was 58, burdened with enormous debt, a dilapidated farm, and the ghost of a deceased wife. He said she was too young, too deserving of a clean start to bury her youth beside a declining old man. But Wade was wrong. Nora wasn't a dreamy girl who needed someone else to write her ending. She said she knew how to count her age, but she counted differently. She counted a man who fixed the stove so the children wouldn't choke on smoke. She counted the logs delivered at dawn without a thank you. She counted the 2 cups of coffee already brewed on the kitchen table. Then she told him the secret from Billings, a marriage annulled just 3 weeks before the wedding, simply because that suitable man wanted her to give up teaching, hand over her savings, and become a docile shadow. Wade was silent. In that moment, he realized Nora hadn't come to this desolate place to be rescued by him or anyone else. She had come to reclaim her right to decide her own life. The truth is always a bitter pill to swallow. Just as their love had become clearest and most genuine, the price to pay came most cruelly. An official warning letter from the school board awaited her. The choice was chillingly cold. End the dignifying trips to Hart Ranch,
or she would be stripped of her job and expelled from town.
The turning point of the story had arrived. The conflict is no longer an internal struggle, but has become a life-or-death battle against the forces that seek to stifle their freedom.
But before Nora could give the school board an answer, the Wild West delivered its most brutal test. A blinding storm swept through the valley. Fence shattered. Wade's livelihood teetered on the brink of destruction as his cattle panicked and scattered. Meanwhile, Eli Lane disappeared on his way home. And Nora Bell wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for the storm to pass, or for the men in town to allow her to go rescue her student. It was a moment of ultimate choice. Wade watched his livelihood slip away in the storm. Losing the cattle meant losing the farm. But when he saw Nora's tracks leading her to her death, he understood. There are things that, if lost, leave one penniless. But there are people that, if not protected, cease to be human. They had weathered the storm together, sharing a rope to pull Eli back from the brink of death. But they didn't know that their survival through the blizzard would be the perfect excuse for Silas Pike to deliver the final blow. Their shared survival through the blizzard didn't bring them a medal, but a sentence. Silas Pike laid his cards on the table. The credit for saving the cattle would be signed, with only one condition. Wade Hart had to publicly sever all ties with teacher Nora Bell.
Wade chose the most despicable path of the good. He took the villain himself. He cut off contact, stopped transporting firewood, and buried himself in work, self-destructing to protect her reputation.
But Nora rode straight to the farm. She looked the stubborn man straight in the eye and declared, her whole life she had been subjected to men who, in the name of safety, deprived her of her right to choose. She didn't need him to sacrifice himself by disappearing. She needed him to have the courage to share the consequences with her.
That night, Wade reopened his late wife's keepsake box. At the bottom of the box was the message Liza had written before she died. Don't turn my love into a door that locks you inside. On Sunday morning, the entire town of Gray Creek crowded into the classroom. It wasn't a ceremony, but a trial. Silas issued an ultimatum. Sign a pledge never to set foot in Hart Ranch again and cease all inappropriate contact, or Nora would be stripped of her job and expelled from town.
The room fell silent. Nora picked up the pen. She looked at the familiar faces, at the children she had saved. Then, she calmly placed the pen down on the table. Nora didn't refuse to sign the pledge out of pride. She refused because she knew that dignity wasn't something to be bargained for. And just then, Wade Hart walked through the door.
The 58-year-old widower didn't speak sweet words. He declared before the entire town he might not be able to repay the Pike Bank debt. He might lose his father's cattle and farm. But there are debts a man cannot repay by trampling on a woman's honor. If the price of holding on to the land was cowardice, then the farm was no longer worth keeping. That unwavering determination shattered the town's hypocrisy. Even Ben Pike, the instigator of the tragedy, his wounded pride, had to stand up and acknowledge his father's dirty control. Silas Pike failed, but the bank still didn't disperse the funds. Miracles don't just fall from the sky, but the frontier doesn't exist because of miracles or solitary individuals.
It exists because of community. Nora established the Winter Relief Book. Not charity, but a survival exchange. Those with firewood contributed, those with strength repaired the fence, those with excess hay shared. Wade and Nora's love was no longer a whispered secret in the shadows. It became a shared rhythm of labor, a shoulder-to-shoulder struggle to keep the entire valley from being consumed by the cold. Spring finally arrived in Montana. The cattle survived, the school remained open, and the silence in Wade's house was no longer a soulless emptiness. Jacob Walker had spent 11 years trying to convince himself that his life was over. He had counted his age and thought that love was a privilege that had expired. But when he saw the young teacher sitting before him with 2 warm cups of coffee, he suddenly understood something. The heart doesn't count age or years. It only counts those brave enough to stay with us when the harshest winter arrives. Wade Hart made a mistake that many of us have made. He predetermined the limits of his own life. He looked at the number 58, at a wound 11 years old that wouldn't heal, and concluded that the door to the future was locked. But the heart never reads the calendar. It doesn't care about numbers or societal judgments. It only recognizes the truth when a woman is willing to brave a snowstorm, stand before all the most powerful men in town, and say no to protect her own freedom. You are never too old, too hurt, or too late to deserve to be loved again. And true love in this wild frontier is never about possession or flowery words. It's 2 cups of coffee brewed in silence. It's about being willing to risk everything you have to protect the dignity of the one you love. What about you? Is there a winter that's making you hesitate to knock on the door of the future? Or is there a silent sacrifice you've never told anyone about? Please leave your story in the comments below. I always read every word you share. And if Wade and Nora's journey to reclaim their lives has warmed your evening, please leave a like to keep this storm lamp burning and subscribe to the channel so we don't lose touch in this wild frontier. The following day, we will leave Gray Creek Valley and venture into the deadly desert landscapes of Wyoming Territory. A deserter is being relentlessly hunted. A lone widow vows to shoot any stranger who dares cross her ranch gate. When 2 men hunted by the world are forced to point their guns at each other for survival, who will pull the trigger first and who will lay down their weapons to save the other? See you in our next story. Until then, keep your fire burning.